I'm glad to see you all here today. I hope everyone's comfortable. I'm not going to do much introducing because you have bios of everyone in your packets. But I want to thank Sam, I want to thank Duncan for being here, and I also want to thank David Hollenberg, who's our university architect. He also, previous to working here, worked for the National Park Service, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a moment. So I'm just going to hand it right over to David, and we're going to get started. Thank you, David. Yeah.
Thank you and welcome. I think this crowd is a tribute to the extraordinary emotional pull of the Park Service, not to mention the tribute to the extraordinary work that our speaker and Mr. Burns did on this wonderful documentary. I think you've all probably seen pieces of it. As Lisa said, I'm the university architect, and it's a position I've held for 5 years. I am a graduate of the architecture school here in a long time ago, 75, and I have been on the faculty in the School of Design in the Preservation Department for about 25 years. So my roots at Penn go back a ways. But prior to coming to Penn, I was at the National Park Service, where I was Director of Design and Construction for the Northeast region, which basically is a region from Maine to West Virginia, a region primarily populated by historic parks more than the breathtaking natural parks that are so much, very much the focus of the wonderful documentary. Like all Park Service people, I need to tell you a story. So much of my career in the Park Service was involved in the remaking of Independence Mall at Independence Park here in Philadelphia, and some of you locals may know what a transformation occurred there throughout the 90s and into the early part of this decade. One of the components of that is something called the National Constitution Center, which you haven't seen, you should. It is, as it says, it's a museum about the history and meaning and ongoing meaning of the Constitution Center. And they had assembled a glittering advisory group to formulate that building, which included 3 Supreme Court justices, Scalia, O'Connor, and Breyer. And one morning, the first morning of that meeting of that group was going to be a tour of Independence Hall prior to its opening to the public. So we all met at 9:30, and I got to go as sort of, my role was to sort of represent the regional office's interest in this major development, which was being done by all sorts of clients with all sorts of money. It was complicated and wonderful. So we arrived at 9:30 before the doors of Independence Park opened, and got essentially a private tour with these justices and scholars. We were all dressed normally. To my dismay, the Supreme Court folks didn't show up in their robes. They looked like all of us. I don't know if there's a Supreme Court justice in the room. If there is, you should be in your robe. You should always be in your robe. But they didn't. They were in jeans and sort of looked like normal people. And I think this was before the sort of security apparatus that we've overlaid on everything. And a middle-aged man and his son, apparently his son, must have assumed we were on a tour, and so they joined us. So we had the best ranger in the park, and they're all fantastic, and 3 Supreme Court justices and major scholars on a tour of Independence Hall, plus this man and his apparent son. I did not know and could not know until the end of the incident I'm about to describe that whether he was a foreign tourist or an American citizen. He was clearly from India, but I did not know anything about him, of course. And so we were walking around, and everybody's having a wonderful tour. And of course, the level of questioning from everyone but him is at a very high level. And we go to the second floor. I suspect most of you have been to Independence Hall. If not, you should. The second floor is the wonderful assembly room, and the ranger made a casual comment, seemingly casual, which was, the floor of this room is original. So Washington and Madison and Jefferson danced and met and walked on this floor. And we were all nodding in the way that sort of intellectuals do. Isn't that interesting? This man took his son and put his hands on the shoulders of his son and slowly pushed him down so that he had to touch the floor. And he said to him, "You touch that floor, that's real." It was chilling. And the 3 justices are there like, and I think they got it like that. It was so powerful, and it's what the Park Service does so well. So what I loved about my time at Independence Park was this whole notion of physical places being shot through with meaning. And the Park Service, we talk about a sort of its stewardship role, but it's really a storyteller. It's really about telling stories, and it's, to my amazement, many times listen to me saying we. I now work for Penn, not the Park Service. I'll do we for both things today. The Park Service will often find itself actually changing physical fabric to support the story. which was a real surprise to me as a preservation architect, but I think a legitimate one. And Independence Hall is a glittering example of that. Much of its fabric is not original. As much of it is from the 1960s and 70s, except for things like this magical sacred floor. So Independence Park was a very important, beautiful urban park with beautiful historic buildings, great new contemporary buildings that tried to build on and enhance its meaning, all tied together with a fantastic landscape. Sort of sounds like Penn, right? That's why I'm here, and I made the move from the Park Service to here, and I'm delighted to do so. It's a great time to be here, and you'll have a chance to see some of the open space, I hope, that's being added to the campus to our east, Penn Park and Shoemaker Green, and I really look forward to this conversation. So welcome, Sam and Dave, and all of you.
Thank you, David. And it's nice to be here, nice to see you, and especially nice to have Dayton Duncan here. I'm guessing that most of you already know something about Dayton, but he's done a lot of interesting things since graduating from Penn 40 years ago with a degree in that incredibly practical pre-professional track, German literature. So I'll give the Cliff Notes version of his life now, and we'll try to fill in some of the gaps when we talk in a few minutes. Dayton is an award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker who for many years has been involved with the work of his friend and fellow resident of Walpole, New Hampshire, Ken Burns. He was the writer and producer of the critically acclaimed Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Core of Discovery, the co-writer and producer of Mark Twain, and the writer and producer of Horatio's Drive, about the first transcontinental automobile trip, which is a neat little film, and we're going to see a little clip of it later. He was also a consultant on Burns' 3 award-winning series for public television, The Civil War, Baseball, and Jazz, a consulting producer for The War, and the co-writer and consulting producer for The West, which was a 12-hour series about the history of the American West. Most recently, of course, he produced and wrote The National Parks, America's Best Idea, a 6-episode, 12-hour documentary that won 2 Emmys, one for Best Nonfiction Series and one for Best Writing. And we'll spend some time talking about that film today, and I'm hopeful that we can get him to talk about some other projects as well. Having started out as a newspaper reporter, Dayton is the author of 10 books, ranging from Out West, A Journey Through Lewis and Clark's America, to Grassroots, 1 Year in the Life of the New Hampshire Presidential Primary. And the latter evolved out of his long interest and frequent immersion in politics. He was Chief of Staff to New Hampshire Governor Hugh Galen, Deputy National Press Secretary for Walter Mondale's presidential campaign in 1984, and National Press Secretary for Michael Dukakis's 1988 presidential campaign. 2 years ago, he was officially named an honorary park ranger, which is a designation bestowed upon fewer than 50 people, and if I remember right, it's a pretty interesting mix. Does that include Richard Nixon in there?
Dead presidents and Hank Williams Jr.
Oh, beautiful. And according to his wife, Diane, Dayton is never in a bad mood when he's wearing his park ranger hat. So I thought we'd start with a clip from the National Parks. It's about 5, maybe 6 minutes long, focuses on a key figure in the history of the parks and in the history of conservation in the U.S. And after that, Dayton and I will come up on stage and resume the conversation we started 2 years ago when I was working on the article I did for the Gazette. So Dayton, it's great to have you here, and now let's take a look at the clip.
Roosevelt will always baffle people who don't hunt because he both loved animals and loved hunting them. And in Yellowstone, what he really wanted to do was shoot a mountain lion. At the time, park managers were killing predators. It was something that was going on anyway. And so, to Roosevelt's mind, well, why not me?
The president's advisors thought killing any animal in a national park would be bad politics and quietly dissuaded him. In all, Roosevelt spent 2 weeks in Yellowstone, including several days traveling in a horse-drawn sleigh to the park's interior, still covered in some places by up to 6 feet of snow. He saw the Norris Geyser Basin and Old Faithful, and skied to the rim of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. But these wonders held only passing interest to him compared to the park's wildlife. In addition to the larger animals, he recorded sightings of pine squirrels and snowshoe hares and scores of different birds, including a pygmy owl, the first he had ever seen. He responded with boyish glee, Burroughs wrote. I think the president was as pleased as if we had bagged some big game.
At one point, Roosevelt sees a mouse that he thinks is new to science, so he jumps off this sleigh and grabs it with his hand and kills it and then stuffs it.
While we all went fishing in the afternoon, the president skinned his mouse and prepared the pelt for Washington. It was done as neatly as a professed taxidermist would have done it. This was the only game the president killed in the park. John Burroughs.
On April 24th, at the end of Roosevelt's visit, the entire population of the town of Gardner, Montana, gathered at the park's north entrance for a special ceremony. A new arch to welcome visitors to Yellowstone was under construction, and the president had agreed to speak at the laying of the arch's cornerstone. For the occasion, Roosevelt reluctantly changed out of his camping clothes, put on a business suit, and rode through town to the awaiting crowd. He watched as the cornerstone was carefully put into place, then climbed to a rough platform on the stonework of the incomplete pillar and began to speak.
The Yellowstone Park is something absolutely unique in the world so far as I know. This park was created and is now administered for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. The scheme of its preservation is noteworthy in its essential democracy. The only way that the people as a whole can secure to themselves and their children the enjoyment in perpetuity of what the Yellowstone Park has to give is by assuming ownership in the name of the nation and jealously safeguarding and preserving the scenery, the forests, and the wild creatures.
Roosevelt argued that the parks are a democratic experience. That was his essential argument about the national parks. That the rich people always have their playgrounds, they know how to amuse themselves, and that America as a classless society, or at least a society that would like to be classless, needs to have places where regular human beings can go and stand side by side with the rich and privileged and enjoy the same experience and not be made to feel that they are somehow less. And so his primary argument was that the national parks are a democratic experiment in nature.
Before he got back on the train to resume his trip, Roosevelt had deliberately quoted from the act of Congress that had made Yellowstone the world's first national park, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Later, when the arch was finally completed, that phrase would be permanently carved into its mantle, so that everyone who entered Yellowstone would be reminded of why the park was there and for whom.
I remember the first time I arrived in Yellowstone, I got off the bus right outside the north entrance where there's that wonderful stone arch that says, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. It doesn't say for the benefit and enjoyment of some of the people or a few of the people. It says all of the people. And for me, that meant democracy. And for me, that meant I was welcome. And I stepped outside, and as I was stepping down under the ground, there was a bison, a 2,000-pound animal walking by. And there was no one else around it. The bison was just strolling by. And I looked up at the driver and I said, does this happen all the time? And he looked at me and said, all the time. And I said to myself, I've arrived. And I can't imagine not being in any other place. And to be honest with you, once I stepped off that bus, I never got back on.
powerful piece. Thank you.
Shelton Johnson is a guy I met in Yosemite, where he's a park ranger, where he has kept alive the story of the African-American buffalo soldiers, who were the first defenders of Yosemite before there was a National Park Service, David. And he was very proud about the stories that he was telling, and I told him that Ken and I were working on a film about the national parks, and we exchanged cards, and for the next 3 or 4 years I'd get an email from him about every 4 months saying, you know, Dayton, Ranger Shelton Johnson here, you're going to tell the story about the buffalo soldiers, right? And I say, Shelton, believe me when I tell you this, we're telling the story of the buffalo soldiers. We take a long time to do our film, so it'll be a while. And when we sat down, when it was time for us to do interviews out in San Francisco, I had him on our list of people that we wanted to talk to tell the story about the buffalo soldiers. And little did I realize until we asked him, besides asking people that we interviewed the sort of required questions of their expertise. Clay Jenkinson is a Theodore Roosevelt scholar, that's why he was talking about Teddy Roosevelt. We'd ask them other larger questions about special moments that they might have had in a national park and other things. And Shelton turned out to be, you know, John Muir incarnate, and ended up being the star, I think, of our film, and was in every episode besides the one about the buffalo soldiers. And now is the most famous park ranger in America. Not just because he was in our film, but then partly through our film, he got to show Oprah Winfrey around Yosemite. So that raised him to a status that we all only aspire to. He's a great person.
That's great. Well, like Shelton, in a way, you never really left at some level. Left the parks, I mean, in the sense that you visited a bunch of them when you were a kid, you went to Glacier courting your wife, and then went back with your own kids. And would you mind, I don't want to cover too much ground that I covered in the article, since I know everyone memorized every single word, but would you mind telling the story about you and your son, Will?
Sure. It was 1998, and my family was on what for us is our epic family trip. I had finished the Lewis and Clark film, and for the first time since I graduated from Penn with my German literature degree, could actually afford to take a vacation. And so we packed the kids up into my Suburban and hit about every national park, you know, short of the West Coast. And the first one we went to was Glacier National Park, which had been a special romantic park for Diane and I, who had visited while we were courting. And so it was the first one we took our kids back to. I don't know how many of you have been to Glacier National Park, so you know what a spectacular place it is. And it has the most beautiful road in America, which is Going to the Sun Road, which comes in through the center of the park and climbs up over Logan Pass and then descends.
One of the hairiest roads in America, too.
My friend Steve Townsend, who was a roommate of mine, and I went out to that area when we were after our junior year. And he's a real chicken when it comes to heights. He would not like going to the Sun Road. But anyway, at the center of that spectacular highway, at Logan Pass, there's a little hike you can take toward a place called Hidden Lake. And there was a snow cover still, even though it was a little after 4th of July, patches of snow. And our daughter, Emmy, who's 3 years older than Will, for her, the word hike is a 4-letter word. And when she saw that snowfield, what she'd have to wade through to get to this hike we were going to do, she bailed out quickly, and she was 11, and so Diane stayed with her. So this was a big moment for Will to be out of the shadow of his big sister. And we got through the snowfield and up over the pass and coming toward Hidden Lake. And this family of mountain goats started approaching on the trail. And I told Will if we were really quiet, maybe we wouldn't scare them. Well, as it turns out, we were probably the 250th 50,000th person at that family mountain goats has seen that. So they weren't giving the trail up to us anyway, so we just stepped off the trail. They came within arm's length of us, and it was just this, excuse me a second. It was a great moment, all the way back to the parking lot. Will was just talking like crazy. He was so excited that he had this adventure on his own, without his big sister, seen the mountain goats. I named him Goat Boy, as in the Indian tradition of a significant moment in your young life ascribes your name to you. And in honor of the Lewis and Clark expedition, I was forcing everyone in the family, including myself, to keep a journal during this entire vacation. And that night in his journal, in his little block letters, Will wrote, I read it after he went to sleep, excuse me, this was the most exciting day of my life. And that's the day Glacier National Park became my favorite national park.
It's such a great story. So a couple of days later, you decided you needed to film about the national parks.
Yeah, that was on that trip that it was actually on a drive from south of the Grand Tetons toward Salt Lake that it came to me that the national parks are this American invention. We had done films on other American inventions, baseball and jazz in particular. We'd done films about significant American figures and events, Lewis and Clark and the Civil War, and even Horatio's Drive, the first automobile trip across the United States. And that it struck me that why we hadn't even done that yet, gotten to the parks. And so, so when I got home, I sat down with my friend Ken Burns, lives in the same small town as I do, where we've raised our families, and I'd been prepared to give him this long, hard sell about what we ought to do this film on the national parks. It had taken me 10 years to convince him to do this film on the first automobile trip across the United States. So I came fully prepared with all the arguments and everything. And I said, okay, well, I think we ought to do a film. It's about an American idea like baseball and jazz. Its beginning is in 1864 during the Civil War, when a president named Lincoln, who's his favorite president, was in office. I said it's basically the Declaration of Independence applied to the landscape. The Declaration of Independence, of course, written by Thomas Jefferson. So by this point, I've referenced 4 films that we've done. And so I said it's about the national. And he said, no, let's do it. So it took me 45 seconds.
That's great.
And that, and over the course of the next 10 years, besides doing work on some other films, my job, I put quotations around that, was to go to every national park, to meet the people who knew the most about each individual park, to read everything I could find about each of the parks. My job required me to come back to the parks with the film crews and film those places in the most exquisite moments of the day, which is dawn and at dusk. And my job was then to find the people who know the most and arrange for us to interview them, and sometimes do the interviews and sometimes sit in while Ken did them. And then to write a script, and I love the writing portion. I love the research part of it, and I loved obviously going to the parks. I say that I love the writing of it. Diane, were she here, would be rolling her eyes because when I'm in the midst of writing, she doesn't think I'm having a good time. And then my job is to work with the best filmmaker in America, who's one of my best friends, and turn it into a film. So if somebody here thinks they got a better job than me, we can talk later.
How has meeting and working with Ken changed your life? I mean, aside from
going to all 58 of the national.
Yeah, among other things, yeah.
Well, I met him. He was I was then the chief of staff for the governor of New Hampshire, and he had just moved to New Hampshire, working on his very first film, Brooklyn Bridge. To support himself, he had to take freelance assignments, and he had a freelance assignment with the BBC to interview the governor of New Hampshire about these different programs we had to renovate, to restore old mill communities in New Hampshire. We had a whole program going trying to encourage these towns that were old mill towns to rejuvenate their downtowns and use the old mill buildings, stuff like that. So his job was to do this interview for the BBC. He came in to do the interview, and I talked to him on the phone, and this guy was coming with his equipment, and I kept waiting for the filmmaker to arrive because he looked like he was about 17, maybe the intern. And so while we're talking, while he's setting it up, he told me that he had moved to New Hampshire. He was working on a film about the Brooklyn Bridge. And I thought it was both odd to be making a film about a bridge and to make a film about a bridge in New York, in New Hampshire, but what the heck. And a year later, he called me up to let me know that that film that he was working on had been nominated for an Academy Award. And the governor and I were going out to Hollywood because On Golden Pond had just been shot in New Hampshire, and it was nominated as well, and we were very proud of that. And we're trying to promote New Hampshire as a place for filmmakers to make their films. So we thought we went out, and around that time we could go to the studios and talk to people. And so we hooked up with Ken and his then wife Amy and spent some time with them. And he and I just became friends over time. And when I got back into writing by failing so miserably in politics. If you want to have some free time on your hand, work on some losing personalities. And anyway, he and I became better friends, and our families became friends, and we realized sitting around tables at dinner, he'd be telling stories about the film he was working on, I'd be telling stories about the book I was writing. Our families would be bored to tears, but the other person would be excitedly listening, and that was the basis of our friendship. And I think the main thing is that working with him has made me a better writer. He's writing for film is different than writing a book. A script for an episode of the National Parks, a 2-hour episode would be about 40 pages versus a book. And the demands of it are different. And you always have to be winnowing and winnowing and winnowing, and in that decision making, your writing becomes better.
Tighter.
And also, it's just, as I say, I'm not being entirely flippant when I say that I have the best job in America, because right now, I get to, as part of our collaboration, the films that I write and produce are ones that were my idea. And then the others I'm a consultant or advisor on. So I like to say that I get to do a self-directed postgraduate degree in a topic of my choosing. So I got to go out and learn everything I can about some topic that I'm excited or intrigued by, and get paid.
That's even better than working for the Gazette.
You can't beat that. So that's how it's affected my life. But we 34 million people watch the national parks, and I wish 34 million people bought my books. It's a better way to, if you've got something to say, it's a good way to do that.
Great. Do you want to talk about any of your favorite characters in the national parks? I mean, there were so many great ones. Teddy Roosevelt was an obvious choice because he's so larger than life, but obviously you had a lot of other pretty interesting characters.
I mean, the main thing that came through in the research of that, for that film, and hopefully comes through, loud and clear in the film itself, is that we tend to think of the national parks as the sort of automatic government program, these places that have always been there, always been saved, end of story. And as you look into the history of it, you find just the opposite. They haven't always been there. The places have always been there, but they haven't been saved. It took the work of individuals, usually a person or a group of people who became so passionately devoted to a place that they set about, oftentimes with long, hard campaigns, 10, 15, 20 years, to convince Congress to finally set it aside as a national park. So it's democracy at its best. Each of these parks, you turn over the rock of any of the national parks and you'll find that one person or two people who loved this place so much that they did everything they could so that people that they would never meet and generations they would never know would have the same chance to see that same view and fall in love with the place just as he did. And so, boy, I met a lot of people, historical characters that I had great admiration for. Since we're here in the chemistry building that I never visited when I was in an undergraduate here, two of my favorites turned out to have been biologist scientists. A guy named George Melendez-Wright, who really is responsible for trying to convince the Park Service that their mandate is not just to preserve scenery, but to preserve the wildlife and the plant life as well, and really started this movement that, again, we now take for granted. That when he first started his studies, it was routine in most national parks to kill all the predators, even to the extent that he found that in Yellowstone, rangers were told to go out and stomp the pelican eggs because more pelicans would create more competition with the fishermen. And so they just figured, well, we'll just, reduce that. And of course, they killed all the coyotes. They had long since killed all the wolves. They fed the bison in the wintertime and did things like that. And his argument was that parks are also this place to let nature be what it's supposed to be. And then later, the fellow who sort of took up that mantle for him, because he died in a car accident when he was 36, Wright did, was a guy named Adolph Murray, who literally helped save the wolves from being exterminated up in Alaska. And then it was that movement that helped finally result in restoring wolves in the lower 48. And they were amazing to me, not only because I found it interesting to read what they wrote as scientists, but also to realize that a really good scientist is a really good observer, and oftentimes turns out to be a really terrific writer as well because of that power of observation.
Now, and you talk about the long struggles that many of these parks had to actually become parks. Some of the people that you talked to afterwards, after fighting bitterly, or that you had clips of, after fighting bitterly to prevent these parks, later came around thinking that kind of good thing had happened, right?
Yeah, we had a couple of things. We were fortunate to be able to have the proof of the pudding. A big fight in the Tetons took place in the 40s and, well, mostly in the 40s, about expanding, having the park also include Jackson Hole, the sagebrush plain that makes the foreground for the mountains themselves. There was a horrible fight. Franklin Roosevelt finally used the extraordinary powers of the Antiquities Act to bypass Congress and set aside that place as a national monument. And all hell broke loose in Wyoming. They called him, this was in the 40s, they had headlines comparing him to Hitler and doing, mounted guys with guns riding through the new monument, daring the Park Service to try to arrest them. And the Wyoming legislature got Congress to override the national monument, which then Roosevelt vetoed, and it went on for almost 20 years. A guy who was at the center of it, by the name of Cliff Hansen, who was a local rancher, was interviewed. He died the day before we were set to interview him. But we were able to find from Salt Lake City's public television a tape of an interview they'd done, and talked about being part of that protest. And then once it was finally saved and the compromise was worked out, it became a larger national park. He said that, he's the first to admit that he was just wrong. That in saving that place, they really did save that whole area. And of course, if you owned properties, he did in Jackson, it was probably better for him that it was, that he wasn't, all that wasn't development. So he had the stuff that was still private property. And then we did the same with some people up in Alaska who bitterly fought the notion that it might be a national park, bitterly fought the use of the Antiquities Act, and then came around and now, want the park expanded. And that's true throughout the history of the national parks too, is that, there are interests that for their own reasons don't like the notion of this becoming not just part of the, many parks are already part of the public domain, but the extra, protections that come with the national park, they object to. Maybe they've been grazing cattle there, or maybe they have mining claims, or maybe they dreamed of having a trophy home there or something. And they bitterly oppose it. And about a generation later, then they sort of quasi accept it. And this happened in the Grand Canyon, which Theodore Roosevelt set aside using the Antiquities Act in 1908. Arizona and Congress went ballistic about it. It took another 20 years for it to become a national park over the objections of Arizona and some other members of Congress. And now it's on their license plate. It takes a while. And Stuart Udall, who we interviewed talking about Theodore Roosevelt, said, you're looking for the people with distance in their eyes that can see, over the horizon a little bit, and are willing to do things that will pay off in the long run, where so many of us are sort of caught up in a short-term vision.
Well, I guess that sort of reflects that whole messy business of the essential democracy.
Right.
The democracy isn't always pretty, and there are always going to be fights, and the national parks have really been at the center of it.
Yeah,
and many issues still resonate.
When we came out with our film, we showed it, we did some private screenings to lots of members of the Park Service, and thank you for mentioning that I'm an honorary Park and it was, I think it's been good for many of them, because it's a reminder of, if you're in the Park Service, you're a federal employee, and these are not necessarily happy times to be a federal employee, because a lot of people, are carping about you and doing other things. Your pay's probably not as good as it might be if you did something else, but and you're caught up in the day-to-day management of a park or something like that. And what our film tried to do, besides tell the history of the park, is reminded even them of what this is all about. That these are these national treasures, and they're the guardians of them, and we thank them for it, and help, just, it doesn't matter what job you've got, every once in a while it's good to have somebody going to remind you that what you do may have some importance, and remind you why you're doing it in the first place, versus all the detail stuff that you can, lose yourself in, and hopefully pat you on the back.
I think now might be a good time to show one more clip, which is from Horatio's Drive. Maybe would you want to just set it up for a second?
Sure. Horatio's Drive, I think I mentioned, took me 10 years to convince Ken to do. It's the story of the first automobile trip across the United States. I was doing, my third book was called Miles from Nowhere, in which I traveled to the most sparsely populated counties of the United States, all of them out in the West. And I came across this book that I was reading, and had a little paragraph that just said, in 1903, a guy named Horatio Nelson Jackson, a doctor from Vermont, was in San Francisco. He placed a $50 bet that this new-fangled contraption called the horseless carriage actually had a future. And to prove it, he would bet $50 that he could drive one from San Francisco to New York. And set out, hired a guy to help him be his mechanic and driver, adopted a dog along the way, and finally made it through after all these travails. And I thought, God, that's a great story. And for a number of years after that, when I wasn't working on something else, I'd try to learn a little bit more and a little bit more, and I started badgering Ken. This would be a great film. It's exactly 100 years after Meriwether Lewis left Philadelphia, actually, to become the first American citizen to cross the continent. In 1803 is when he left. 1903, a guy's going the other direction to become the first car, and really sort of launches the, you know, if there's one invention that transformed America in the 20th century, it would be the automobile. But it was just a great road trip, basically. And so we made a film about it.
That's a great little film. Let's
get out of the way.
Yeah, we can shoot this next one.
Thursday, June 11th. My dear Swipes, we put on our new springs and one new tire and left Ontario a little after 4. We crossed the Snake River by a ferry and are now in Idaho. Shortly after we left, it commenced to rain, and for the first time, we had to take out our rubber clothing. This made traveling very bad. We found a stream to ford and thought, of course, we could make it as we had many others, by shooting it. But the mud was very deep, and we got stuck in the center of it. We did not arrive in Caldwell until 12 o'clock at night, and then soaking wet. We put up at the Pacific Hotel, and the people noticed we were carrying with us a very strong odor. We had run over a skunk.
Before leaving Caldwell, Idaho the next morning, Jackson added a third member to the expedition, a young bulldog named Bud, which he purchased for $15. Riding in front, and just like his master, wearing a pair of goggles to keep the dust from stinging his eyes, Bud quickly learned to watch the road ahead just as intently as Crocker and Jackson, bracing himself for every bump and turn. Bud soon became an enthusiast for motoring, Jackson bragged, adding he was the one member of our trio who used no profanity on the entire trip. Taking roads that paralleled the rail line, Jackson now planned on making up for lost time. But once again, he got some bad advice and followed the wrong set of tracks, which took them 38 miles out of their way before they realized it. They motored on to the town of Haley, just south of Idaho's Sawtooth Mountains. From there, Jackson telegraphed the Winton Company in Cleveland, placing an order for them to ship him a new air intake pipe, since the original had dropped off somewhere along the road. It was the first time he had contacted the company directly, and the first time Winton officials became aware that one of their cars was trying to cross the continent.
I think I'd originally, the idea was to finish after Bud, and since, if we had more time, I'd like to keep watching it because it's such a great clip from, it's really a neat movie.
We're going to show you all 12 hours.
That's right. Nobody's leaving.
You get out at 3:45.
That's right.
That was Tom Hanks, who was the voice of Horatio Nelson Jackson. We're very fortunate that in Ken's first film, he had a couple of pretty, some of the people who were the voices in the film, in his early films, were people who lived in the town of Walpole, New Hampshire, but a couple of them were pretty good actors who then told their friends who told their friends, and so we're really spoiled now because we're able to get somebody like Tom Hanks to be the voice of Horatio Nelson Jackson, and we pay the SAG minimum, because we can't, it's public television, we can't afford to pay them, you know, higher rates than that. But a lot of them enjoy it quite a bit. So we got to spend a day with Tom Hanks in a recording studio in Santa Monica when we were doing this film. And when it was by the afternoon we were done, then I got to give him a check for $350. And I said, now here's my advice. Diversify this. I went to 10. And so don't put it all in just one.
Learned that all in German literature. Yeah. So was Ken happy with when you finally that you had talked him into this?
Yeah, he had a great time. I went with the cameraman all the way, retraced the route all the way from San Francisco to New York, and certain places I would strap him onto the hood of the Suburban with this harness thing that we called the bra, and he would film with a HD cam. We still use film instead of video when we're filming. We're old-fashioned that way. But for that, I'd have him shoot the stuff that we turned black and white to make it seem like, you know, early 1900s things. But so we went all the way across, and Ken joined us for a part in Wyoming, and you know, anytime he gets a chance to get out and get behind a camera and see a new part of the United States, he's a happy camper.
Great. You want to talk about any projects you've got that you're working on right now? I know you said something about the Dust Bowl when I talked to you 2 years ago.
Yeah, we are. You know, we do all of our work we do for PBS, and I just want to throw a plug in for them because we believe so much in both the mission of public television and also how it allows people like us to do the kind of films that we do. As Ken likes to point out, no commercial network would have allowed him to do his breakthrough series on the Civil War, 10 hours on it. They would have laughed him, you know, the networks would have laughed him out of the room had he proposed it. And 12 hours on the national parks would not be possible on commercial networks or cable networks. And when I'm writing, I don't have to write thinking that, you know, every 7.5 minutes or 8 minutes I've got to sort of concoct some sort of quasi cliffhanger to keep you watching, while the next 2 minutes of, you know, that advertisements for all those maladies that those of us in my class never thought we'd have, and now we pay close attention to those ads. You know, come on. And then you got to bring it back up and then start again in every 8 minutes. And so we can make a scene as long, as short as we want. We have educational things that go along with each of our programs, so that every school in the United States got lesson plans and things about national parks to help them teach. There's a website that, you know, the Lewis and Clark website from a film that he and I did 14 years ago is still the most visited website on a part of the PBS website.
That's great.
And it keeps, and they rebroadcast them all the time. So it's just a great feeling of something that you create that, particularly for television, that it just, you know, doesn't appear once, and if you missed it, you're just out of luck. I mean, so it has a greater life. So that's my plug. Okay, sorry. You can give to Penn, but then write a check to PBS. So we have Florentine Films has plans for films that are in progress or in some stage of progress that will take us to 2019. There's a film on Prohibition that's already done, and it comes out this fall in October, I think. It's a 3-episode, really great film, written by my friend Jeff Ward and produced by Lynn Novick, directed by Ken. Next year is the film that is in the midst, we're starting to finish the editing of it, that I've written and produced, on the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which is also a very powerful story that relies very heavily on interviews that I conducted with 26 people out in the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas who lived through those incredible years, almost a decade, in the 1930s, when, you know, the soil was blowing all the time, and little brothers and little sisters of these folks were dying of what was called dust pneumonia. And just every story that our parents told us about the Depression is there, in addition to which the soil was lethal. So that comes out in 2012. In 2013, Ken's oldest daughter, Sarah, and her husband, who's worked with us a number of years, and Ken is the director, have a sort of an unusual film by our lights. It's on the Central Park jogger case. I don't know if you might remember the woman who was brutally attacked and raped in Central Park, and then the whole media circus came about these young black and Hispanic boys who were, quote, wilding, and were convicted and sent off to prison, and then recently the person who actually committed the crime was, you know, stepped forward. So it's about that incident. And then in 2014 is a 7-episode film that's now starting editing on the 3 Roosevelts, Theodore, Eleanor, and Franklin. And it's trying to look at them not only of how significant people they are to America in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, but also, you know, they're all related. They were all related before he married Eleanor. Eleanor was Theodore's favorite niece, and Franklin was Theodore's second cousin, I think. But it sort of looks at him through that family prism. That comes out in 2014. And 2016 is a film on the Vietnam War, similar to the big series that we did on World War II. And then I have just now started the research for the next one that I'm writing and producing, which is on the history of country music, and that's in 2018. By which time it'll be before my 50th reunion. I'll come back, you can reel me in, and I'll be happy to talk about it.
Will you sing?
Pardon?
Will you sing?
Yeah, I'll bring my guitar.
All right. I guess at this point, why don't we open the floor to some questions and answers? It looks like we got a couple out here. And sure, yeah.
You know,
I was just curious with the Antiquities Act, and when I didn't see your national park documentary, and I want to see it now. But I assumed that some of this land was private, and they had to pay the landowners at that point. What did Yellowstone cost the government in order to condemn and get the land?
Okay. Well, actually, most of the national parks, particularly in the early part, were in the West, where the land was already publicly owned, public domain. And so Yellowstone did not cost the government anything to buy the land because it was government land. What was required for them to do was to say, we will no longer open that up for homesteading, we won't open it up for mining, we won't open it up for logging or for grazing. And so in those early parks, they were required by Congress just to draw a boundary around it and say, what's going on in the rest of the West as we move across the continent can't happen in these little pockets of places. The first national park east of the Mississippi, where we don't have much public domain because we settled the park, you know, before, in quick order, was Acadia National Park up off the coast of Maine. And that became a park in 1919 through the efforts of a number of people, John D. Rockefeller Jr., a couple of other people who summered up there and loved the place so much that almost that they bought up the whole big portions of this one island where they had their summer cottages, and counterintuitively said, we love this so much that we now want to give it to the United States so it can become a national park. Even that was not easy. There was a big fight over that. So that was donated. The very first time, oddly enough, that the national park idea begins in 1864, when Yosemite is set aside, though not made a, quote, national park. 8 years later, in Yellowstone, in 1872, was the world's first national park in Yellowstone. In 1933, when Great Smoky Mountain National Park was made, and again, much of it was being donated. The states of Tennessee and North Carolina raised money and so forth. They were running short of money. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the federal government put up some of the money to buy the land from the timber companies to make it a national park. That was the first time that the federal government ever spent any money for the land. Now it's much more, now it's, particularly in the east versus in the west, there's still some places in the west that could become national parks that won't require them to buy the land. That just requires them to put different restrictions on how the land that you and I own, can be used. But please watch all 12 hours, and I'll call you and give you the test.
Yes, sir.
Given the budgetary crisis that we have now, with deficits and so on, there's been argument that just like almost every ballpark, somebody sponsors a park, Citizens Park here. Is there a real threat that there could be commercial sponsors, so that somebody Yellowstone Park, McDonald's Yellowstone Park?
Right. Did you hear the question about whether, in ballparks right now, all of them have been renamed to, for a commercial sponsor. Given the federal budgetary crisis, is there a chance that that same thing might happen to, say, Yellowstone as McDonald's, welcome to McDonald's Yellowstone National Park? I don't think so. I mean, there is, I was once on I was named to the board of the National Park Foundation, which is chartered by Congress to help raise money to help the national parks. And much of that money, comes from corporate sponsors and individuals as well. And the Park Service is always very much, on the alert for any time that, a corporation that says, well, I'm giving $2 million here, so they do want to be recognized, but the Park Service is always very vigilant about what the regulations can be. Now, obviously, national parks are a creation of Congress. If Congress decided that they were going to put it out to bid, and the President of the United States didn't veto that bill, then supposedly you can. But one of the great things that I found about, it's an odd thing, Americans love their national parks. They really do. And people, I have my own favorite, and those of you who've been to national parks probably have your favorite, and it always has to do with something that you saw there, something you did, somebody you were there with, whatever it is. It's a very deep love. It doesn't automatically translate, oddly, into congressional budgetary support. I got tired of writing, and when I was writing my film, I'd say, having created the national park, Congress did not see fit to appropriate any money to take care of it. That happened over and over again. When they created Hawaii Volcanoes National Park in 1916, they set it aside, but they didn't put up any money because, as one senator said, it shouldn't cost any money to run a volcano. So they're very sparing with the money that the parks need. They've got about an $8 billion backlog of deferred maintenance and things. But history has also shown when there have been big moves to try to whittle away at them, the people really rise up. And the most recent one in our lifetime would have been when the government shutdown of '94, and the blowback on the Republicans for that was as much about the fact that the national parks were being closed as it was for anything else. So I don't think we need to worry about that. But it is a good, if you think, the way I like to tell people to consider the value of the national parks is to think about my favorite film, It's a Wonderful Life, and to think about it if there weren't any national parks. Just as Jimmy Stewart learns the value of his life when his guardian angel shows him what the world would have been like had he not existed. If you want to think about what would America be like without the national parks? Well, you know what it would be like. You and I could not go to the rim of the Grand Canyon and look down into that thing, because it would be lined with really expensive, beautiful homes who probably aren't going to invite us there for the cookout. Yosemite Valley would be a gated community. The Everglades would have been drained and be shopping malls, and in Yellowstone would be Geyser World. It would be this amazing. So, you know, but I think we do have, deep in a lot of us is this, you know, parks are sort of sacred spaces for us, and so I don't think we have to worry about it. We have to be, it's not that somebody won't propose it, it's just that we got to watch out for it.
Yes, ma'am, back there. Can you take the mic?
I have a question about your writing. When I was a Penn here, I took a class in the Civil War, and then later I've seen your Civil War documentary, and I enjoyed yours more. How do you write a compelling script and still tell the story?
Well, that's the secret. So I can't divulge that. I'll be giving it the best job in America. No, I mean, we are old-fashioned narrative storytellers. And that's one way to tell history. It's not the only way to tell history, but it is the way that we do it. We are popular historians. You know, we could not do the work of any of the films that we do, with a few exceptions. Horatio's Drive, I actually, mainly through the help of my wife Diane, a former journalist, found the letters that Horatio Nelson Jackson wrote to his wife, Swipes, and that is really the record of his journey that previously no one knew about. But on the whole, the films that we make rely on the work of great historians who have, you know, gone to places like Penn and other places where they've written entire books on one aspect of the Civil War or one national park. And our job is to, or my job on the ones that I do, is to read as many of those as I can and glean from them the things that are important in the telling of history, but also to try to tell them in a narrative way, that the stories have a beginning and middle and an end. And we try also to give as much space as we can to the people living at the time, taking part in the historical story we're telling, to let them have their voice. So their letters, their diary entries, we give lots of space to. It's finding those things that in their written record that I think, if I'm writing, or Jeff Ward, who writes the others, we think that those help bring that person to life and also move the story along. But that's, you know, we spend we spend twice as long as any other filmmakers would do making a film, and most of it ends up being done in the editing room, where we're trying to decide, we've got to winnow this down, or this is confusing, we've got to winnow this down. And we're trying to make it into a good story, but not at the expense of accuracy, and not at the expense of nuance and the complications of history, which we also don't believe in just sort of, for a long time, the story of American history of the West, which I'm particularly fond of reading about and writing about, was this triumphant march of white people across the continent. By the time we were in college, it was starting to switch into this, the 3rd Panzer Division marching across the continent, destroying everything in its path. We believe that history is, what's wonderful about history is the complications of it, and it's not black and white. That heroes are not uniformly great, and villains aren't uniformly bad. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but we're storytellers, and we deal with a visual medium versus a book, and that's different as well, and it has its own demands. But what we would hope is that we don't pretend that any of the films that we do on any topic is the be-all, end-all of that. We hope it's the introduction to it, that we have gotten people excited about a topic and want to learn more, and in learning more, then they will turn to books and everything. But history is not just dates and facts and figures and names. It's the story of, story is embedded in the word history. It's the story of people just like you and me, who get up in the morning, whatever their era was, trying to do the best that they could, with not knowing what tomorrow might bring. And it's only in retrospect that we can see those people and those events that seem to have, led us to where we are. But that's what, I didn't really get interested in history until I was involved in politics and working for a governor and being involved in making decisions that I knew that we were, you had some information, you didn't have all the information, but you had to make a damn decision. And you hoped it was the best one. And, years later, you might go back and see this place that's now, housing elderly people. That if you hadn't been there, maybe it wouldn't be there. That's a different type of wonderful moment. But what I realized is that all of history was people just like that, just like me. And so I was interested. It awakened my reading of history to think of those as human beings doing that. And I think what we try to do is to bring that to life.
I think we've only got time for about one more question at this point, although I think Dayton will be around for a little bit. We're also going to have books out in the lobby that are being sold and he will sign. So I'm going to take one more, and I'm sorry for the rest, and I hope that you can buttonhole him. I take no responsibility for his escape route
If you want,
afterwards.
I can stay and take questions, and people who want to leave, I won't be offended if you leave.
All right, well, that's even better. Sure.
What do you see as the biggest threats to the national park system as we know it today?
The biggest threats to the national park system as we know it today, they are, well, there is a threat. Global warming is a threat in the sense that my favorite park is Glacier National Park, and in 20 years there won't even be glaciers there. So they'll have to figure a new name for it. So there's that, and Everglades in 80 years will be underwater. But that's a threat that's not to national parks specifically. It's a more larger thing. The biggest threat, I think, to national parks is two things. One is, well, and they're related. One, the biggest threat is apathy. That, we've had different times in our history when we worry that the parks are being, quote, loved to death. Too many people coming to the parks and all that stuff. And that's not, I'm not saying that that's not sometimes a very real problem, but that's a management problem. Dealing with 2.5 million people instead of 1.8 million people coming into Yellowstone is a management problem that good managers can figure out how to deal with. That's a much better problem to have than how come nobody's coming to the national parks. And so one of the things that I was hopeful that our film might do is to try to, renew people's love of the parks and encourage them to take their families out to see a national park and to get more involved with national parks. Because as soon as there's too much, when the apathy meter gets too high, we will never run out of the number of people who are going to look at a canyon with a river flowing through it and say, what a great place for a dam. We're never going to, as Americans, I mean, that's just who we are. We're never going to run out of people who are going to look at a beautiful stand of trees and say, I wonder how many board feet of lumber I can get out of that. Or a beautiful place and say, how many 5-acre lots could I make this one into? Or this mountainside is there precious metal underneath there. That's part of who we are as Americans. But who we are as Americans also loves this land. And so the question for us in the future of the national parks is knowing that that's always going to be there. There's always going to be people who want to commercialize it or to encroach on it or winnow it down, is whether we're going to have another generation of park champions who are going to say, no, you can't do that. And in our nation right now, in an increasingly diverse, increasingly urban population, there are higher and higher percentages of young people who, for a variety of reasons, or segments of our population, who don't think that national parks either A, have any role in their life, or even would welcome them if they wanted to come. So I think one of the great challenges, and the Park Service is aware of this, is how do you let people know that out there are these things that belong to them. The parks belong to everybody. Whether you you come from a family that was able, my family took one vacation when I was growing up. It's all we could afford. We went to national parks because they belonged to us and because we could afford to go there. And that trip, probably ended up with me sitting here. I don't know. I mean, I didn't get back to Iowa and say, boy, when I grow up, I'm going to write a film about national parks. But that trip was an important part of my growing up. And so to the extent that we can get more people to go to the parks, particularly from urban areas, particularly from, minority communities, so they can see, once they get there, like Shelton Johnson, who arrived there at Yellowstone on a bus. I went with him back to the high school he graduated from in central Detroit, okay, when we were promoting our film. I showed him the assembly a little bit of the film, but then I just turned it over to Shelton. And he talked for 25 minutes and took questions, and the first question is, how can I be a park ranger too? So, it's what can we do to make sure that these things that do belong to us, that are this great legacy that we have, that the proportion of people think that they don't mean anything gets so big that then all these other interests that have other designs on it can have their way with it. Sure. And anybody who wants to leave, please.
And I just want to real quickly, we have the room till 5,
Okay.
so I want to thank Duncan, I want to thank Sam, and I also want to thank Dave.